I'm Charlotte. And I've always been the fixer. The one who shows up when things fall apart. The one who keeps her head when everyone else is losing theirs. Every family has that person. And in mine, it's always been me. It started early. I was the kid who cleaned up after my brother's messes so our parents wouldn't yell. I made honor roll while Brandon skipped classes and crashed his first car before I even got my license. When he dropped out of college the first time, I was the one who calmed our mom down, promised her he'd figure it out, and helped him apply again. Then came the credit card debt, the failed business ventures, the mysterious disappearances of family funds. I was the one who handled the late notices, met with the accountants, made the quiet phone calls that kept things from going public. I fixed everything, quietly and without thanks. Because someone had to. Even when I bought my first home, they saw it not as something I earned, but as something available to fall back on. A financial safety net they didn't build, but expected access to. And for years, I let them take pieces of me, bit by bit. Because I believe that's what good daughters do. So when my parents showed up on my porch last week with red eyes and hushed voices, I already knew something was wrong. My mom held a folder in her hands, and my dad couldn't look me in the eye. They sat down at my kitchen table like they were preparing for a funeral. And maybe in a way, they were. Brandon's latest tech startup had collapsed. This one was supposed to be the one that would finally pay off? Finally prove them right for believing in him all these years. Instead, it left them standing in my kitchen, asking me to risk everything I had built. They had mortgaged the family estate. 5 generations of history tied up in a single failed idea. The bank was calling in the debt, and they had 30 days to find the money or lose it all. And of course, there was only one person they thought to ask. They didn't say it outright. Not at first. My mom just reached across the table, her hands trembling as she told me they needed help. My dad mumbled about legacy, about not being able to bear the thought of losing the house, about how much it meant to him, to all of us. But when I asked how much, he finally said it. $800,000. That was everything I had. My home equity, my financial future, every careful decision I had made. And they were asking me to risk it all for Brandon. Again, I didn't answer right away. I stood up, walked to the window, and stared out at the backyard I had spent years turning into a garden. Brandon was out there, tossing a basketball like nothing had happened. Like his failures didn't echo through our family history, or rest on my shoulders every time he fell. My phone buzzed. A text from Ava, my best friend since college and now a partner at a boutique law firm. Don't do it. You know how this ends? I stared at the message, then back at my parents. They looked so hopeful, so desperate, so familiar. I turned around slowly. I'll do it, I said, but this time, not the way they expect. Not quietly, not blindly, and not without protection. Because I'm still the fixer. But this time, I'm fixing it for me. The next morning, I sat across from Ava in her office. The blinds half closed against the early sun. Her desk was covered in legal folders and 3 empty coffee cups. She raised an eyebrow when I told her what my parents had asked for. When I added that I had said yes, she didn't say anything right away. Just opened a fresh legal pad and started writing. I want it airtight, I told her, and I want a clause buried so deep they won't know what it is until it's too late. Ava didn't need an explanation. She'd seen enough over the years to understand. She'd been there when Brandon crashed my car and my parents blamed me. She knew what they were capable of behind closed doors. We drafted the documents that same day. Loan terms, collateral protections, repayment schedule. Ava's specialty was estate law, and she knew every legal shield that could be quietly inserted into a contract. She asked what I wanted it to say if they tried to betray me. Clause 22. I said, make it simple, Any attempt to transfer or reassign ownership of the estate without my written consent would automatically void all claims and transfer full legal ownership to me. Ava nodded, her pen moving fast. We worded it in legal language so dry it sounded boring. The kind of paragraph people skim. That was the point. They'll never read it, she said. Not if they're desperate. They weren't just desperate. They were entitled. They didn't think I'd ever say no. So they wouldn't bother asking why I was suddenly being so formal. I was counting on that. By Friday afternoon, the papers were ready. A full binder of signatures, initials, footnotes, and fine print. I sent my parents a message, come by the office. Ava will walk you through everything. My mom replied within 5 minutes. Of course. Sweetheart. Thank you so much. They showed up together, dressed like it was a business lunch instead of a last-ditch bailout. Brandon didn't come. He never did when things got real. Ava greeted them warmly, offered them water, and began flipping through the binder. My father nodded along, barely reading. My mother scribbled her name quickly, like it hurt her to see the paperwork at all. This is just standard legal protection, Ava explained, pointing to the key sections. Charlotte's putting a lot on the line. We all just want clarity and safety. They smiled like we were all on the same team. Like I hadn't spent years being reminded I was just the daughter. The backup plan. The one they could always call when things went bad. Clause 22 sat on page 17. Middle of the page. Plain font. Not bold. Nothing to call attention. Ava didn't mention it out loud. Neither did I. By the time they left, they had signed every page. Brandon had swung by briefly just to add his initials where needed, barely glancing up from his phone. They thought this was business as usual, that I was still the good daughter, the reliable one. They didn't know that every line they signed was another thread I had stitched into my own safety net. I didn't feel guilty. Not once. I felt clear. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't just reacting to their choices. I was making my own. I wasn't looking to punish them. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I just wasn't going to let them take from me anymore. That evening, Ava and I sat on her back porch. Wine glasses resting on the wooden table between us. You sure about this? She asked. I nodded. I'm not doing this to destroy them. I'm just done letting them destroy me. She raised her glass. Then here's to contracts. And finally, some consequences. I clinked my glass gently against hers. They asked for everything. So I gave them paperwork. A week after the paperwork was signed, things started to shift. It wasn't loud or obvious at first. It was the way my mother hesitated when I walked into the room, or how my father's voice dropped to a whisper when he picked up certain phone calls. I noticed Brandon hanging around the estate more often, pacing the hallway outside my father's study, talking in hushed tones and laughing like nothing had consequences. One night, I walked past the guest room and heard him on the phone. He was bragging, telling someone the estate would be his within the month, that the paperwork was already in motion, and that I'd step aside like always. I didn't interrupt. I opened the voice memo app on my phone and started recording. That was the first file. By the end of the week, I had 12. I wasn't surprised. Not really. I had expected this. I knew how they operated. The only difference now was that I was ready. I kept a notebook in my purse where I wrote down dates, overheard conversations, strange phrases. I emailed the recordings and notes to Ava every evening with a subject line we had both agreed on backup. They had no idea I was documenting everything. They still saw me as the helper, the safe one, the one who could be counted on to keep the family together. And I had been. For too long. One morning, I was in the attic helping my mom sort through boxes for a supposed donation drive when she pulled out an old photo album. She laughed, a little too loudly, and opened it to a Christmas page. There I was at 10 years old, holding a dictionary and a book on math puzzles. Brandon was 8, sitting beside me with a shiny new BMX bike. She touched the photo and said, "I always thought you'd appreciate something practical. You were always so mature." I smiled and didn't answer. I remembered that day clearly. I remembered pretending not to care, telling myself the watch and the workbook were better, more useful. But I had wanted the bike too. That had always been the difference between us. I was taught to be useful. Brandon was taught to be adored. I was praised for making good decisions. He was forgiven for making bad ones. I was handed responsibility. He was handed opportunity. My father always said the estate would go to Brandon because it was tradition. But I had done the accounting. I had covered the taxes when no one else could. I had saved the property more than once. Still, and tradition mattered more than contribution. And being the responsible daughter meant knowing my place. Only now. I didn't. I started watching the mail more closely. One afternoon, I intercepted a letter from a property assessor addressed to my father. The name wasn't Ava's. It was someone new. A private firm. I took a picture of the envelope and sent it to Ava. She called me 10 minutes later and said, "They're trying to revalue the property. That's how they'll try to transfer it early. If the value changes on paper, they can argue for an accelerated timeline, and they'll think you won't notice." I noticed. The next day, Brandon cornered me in the driveway. Grinning, he said he was thinking about adding a home office to the East Wing. I asked him why. And he shrugged, saying once the estate was officially his, he wanted it ready for meetings with investors. I asked what happened to waiting until things were stable. He laughed and said, "Come on, Char. You know how this works. It's always been this way." He wasn't wrong. It had always been this way. My mother called me that evening, voice sugar sweet, asking if we could have a family dinner soon. Just the 4 of us. Nothing formal. She said she had news. I told her I was busy. Then I turned on another recording app and put my phone on the counter, just in case. Later that night, I sat at my desk and opened the folder labeled audio logs. I added the newest files and wrote out a summary for Ava. I paused before I hit send, staring at the blinking cursor. All I could think about was that old Christmas photo. That bike. That watch. That moment when I realized I could be good and still never be enough. But this time, I wasn't trying to be enough. I wasn't trying to earn their respect. I wasn't trying to protect a legacy that was never meant for me. I sent the email. They always chose him. And now, I choose me. The estate had never looked so dressed up. Strings of lights looped around the old oak trees. Champagne bottles sat in crystal buckets. And the dining table gleamed under the weight of polished silverware and our mother's finest china. It was the kind of gathering she lived for. Formal enough to impress the neighbors. Intimate enough to pretend it was just family. Brandon made his entrance late. Of course. Wearing a navy suit too tight across the shoulders and grinning like he'd already won. He hugged our parents like a celebrity greeting fans. Then made a slow, deliberate lap around the room. Shaking hands. Clapping backs. Soaking in the attention he believed he deserved. I stood near the back. Near the bay window, where the light didn't quite reach. No one asked why I was quiet. They were used to it. They called it grace. Humility. Being the dependable one. But tonight, it was something else. Something sharper. Something patient. My father tapped his glass and cleared his throat. The clinking stopped the room. Everyone turned toward the head of the table. He began with a speech about legacy. About how the Sullivan estate had been in our family for nearly a century. Passed from father to son. Generation to generation. Tradition. He called it stability. Pride. I watched my mother glance toward Brandon with watery eyes. Already on the verge of tears. She looked like she'd waited her whole life for this moment. He stood beside my father now. Chest puffed. Nodding solemnly, like he hadn't just defaulted on a $500,000 loan 6 months earlier. With great emotion, my father raised his glass and said it was time to announce the next chapter of our family's story. Brandon placed a hand on his heart like someone about to accept a Lifetime Achievement Award. The room broke into applause before the words were even out. There were congratulations. Cheers. One of our cousins stood up and offered a toast to the future of the estate under Brandon's vision. Someone joked about converting the West Wing into a golf simulator. I saw 2 uncles already arguing about who'd get invited to the first housewarming party. I didn't say anything. I didn't move. I didn't need to. Brandon caught my eye across the room, lifted his glass, and smiled like he was doing me a favor. I smiled back. Small and still. He had no idea. They had built this whole moment for him. Every compliment, every nod, every carefully arranged seat at the table. It had all been planned like a coronation. And they thought I was just a spectator. But I wasn't here to watch. I was here to end the show. I waited until the applause died down, until the last toast was poured and the chatter returned to its usual hum. Then I stepped forward, slow and deliberate, heels clicking softly against the polished floor. My mother noticed first. Her smile wavered. My father turned, confusion tightening the corners of his eyes. There's something I'd like to add, I said. A few heads turned. Most people kept sipping champagne, assuming it was just another sentimental remark. My father gestured half-heartedly, as if to wave me off. But I raised my hand slightly. And at that cue, Ava stepped through the side entrance, a leather folder in one hand. She didn't speak at first, just walked calmly to my side and opened the folder, pulling out a thick document with neat tabs and signatures in familiar handwriting. She glanced at me once, then addressed the room. Earlier this year, Charlotte agreed to provide financial assistance to save this estate. That agreement was formalized through a legally binding contract. Contained within that contract is a provision, Clause 22. The name alone seemed to silence the room. Clause 22 states that any attempt to transfer, sell, or reassign ownership of the estate without Charlotte's written consent immediately and irrevocably voids prior claims. In such an event, full legal ownership is transferred to her. A pause. And based on tonight's announcement and submitted documents, such an attempt has occurred. For a moment, no one reacted. It was like the entire room had frozen mid-thought. Then Brandon laughed, loud and short. You've got to be kidding. That's not real. This is some kind of joke. It's real, Ava replied. It's been signed, notarized, and filed. My father reached for the document, flipping pages with shaking hands. My mother stood rigid, her face drained of color. A guest whispered something and quietly backed toward the door. Brandon's voice rose. You tricked us. You planned this. You're stealing what's mine. I stayed calm. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I just looked at him and said, I'm taking back what I paid for. You can't do this, my father said. His voice cracked. This estate has always belonged to the men in this family. Tradition doesn't override contracts. Ava said quietly. Not in this country. Brandon stepped toward me, fists clenched. But Ava moved slightly, just enough to remind him there were limits. I didn't flinch. You all signed it, I said. You never thought you had to read it. Because you never thought I'd stand up for myself. The room was nearly empty now. Only family remained. And even they looked unsure of where to stand. You called me the fixer, I added. But I was never fixing things. I was just cleaning up your messes. That ends now. No more pleading. No more sacrifices. Just paper. And the law. And this time, it was on my side. The courtroom smelled like dust and paper. Like something old, pretending to be permanent. My parents sat across the aisle from me, stiff in their matching navy suits. Brandon slouched between them, arms crossed, eyes bloodshot, like he hadn't slept in days. I didn't speak to any of them. I hadn't in weeks. Their lawyer? Some hotshot litigator named Carlson. Looked too polished for the mess he'd agreed to represent. He started with a grand opening, claiming emotional manipulation, undue influence, and elder coercion. He said I had taken advantage of my parents at their most vulnerable, when they were desperate and afraid. He painted me as cold, calculating, vindictive. Ava didn't flinch. She stood slowly, gathered her notes, and began with a single sentence. My client saved her family from foreclosure. She never raised her voice, never lost her composure. Every word was clipped and clean, like a scalpel. She handed the judge the original agreement, the full contract with signatures, timestamps, and notary seals. She explained that Clause 22 had been present from the beginning, legally included, fully enforceable. There was no deception, just assumption. My parents had assumed I wouldn't read fine print because I never had power before. Carlson objected, saying they didn't understand what they were signing. Ava raised a brow. These are educated adults. They've signed property documents before. If they didn't read the contract, that's negligence, not coercion. The judge said nothing, just kept taking notes. And her eyes unreadable. Brandon leaned over and whispered something to our father. I didn't care. I was watching the way my mother avoided my gaze. Like if she didn't look at me, she could still believe I was the villain in all this. The ungrateful daughter, the one who betrayed the family. But I hadn't betrayed anyone. I just stopped letting them use me. Ava moved on to intent. She brought up timelines, showed that my parents had already started planning the transfer before the ink on our agreement had dried, that they had contacted new appraisers and lawyers without notifying me, that they were prepared to cut me out the moment they got what they wanted. Carlson interrupted again. He called it circumstantial. He said I had turned on my family for revenge. Ava looked at him, calm as ever. No. She turned on them because they never stood with her in the first place. Silence fell. I didn't speak. I didn't cry. I didn't even shift in my seat. I just watched my parents sitting there, twisting the truth into something small enough to fit inside their shame. Let them say I manipulated. Let them say I tricked them. All I had done was give them what they wanted, just with consequences they didn't expect. And now we were here, in this cold, gray room. Not as family, but as facts and signatures and the law. Ava didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply stepped forward and handed the judge a folder. Inside were 3 items: a timeline of bank transfers, a transcript of text messages, and an audio file labeled the 17th of December. The judge slid on her glasses, nodding for Ava to continue. First, she said, my client transferred $800,000 into a joint holding account managed by her parents. This was not a gift. This was a secured loan under formal contract. She gestured to the signed documents already submitted into evidence. Second, Ava continued, the accompanying messages show intent. We provided texts from Charlotte's mother, confirming they understood the conditions and stating, in her words, that this estate would belong to Charlotte as soon as the debt was cleared. The judge glanced down at the printed transcript, lips tightening. And third, Ava said, we have a voice recording. She pressed play. The courtroom filled with my mother's voice. Soft, sincere. She said, we'll make it right. Charlotte, someday, all of this will be yours. You're saving our legacy. My father's voice followed. Keener but clear. We'd lose everything without you. Carlson stood to object. The judge cut him off. Sight down. Ava stepped back without another word. The silence in the room was different this time. It wasn't cold. It wasn't tense. It was final. The judge removed her glasses and looked at my parents. You may feel betrayed. You may even feel regret, but what I see is a clear contract, deliberate signatures, and a daughter who followed every legal step to protect herself. This court finds no evidence of coercion or abuse. The agreement stands. Ownership of the estate remains with Charlotte Whitaker. The gavel fell. Brandon swore under his breath. My father exhaled like something inside him had broken. My mother didn't move. I stood. I didn't smile. I didn't thank anyone. I didn't turn to gloat or wait for a reaction. I just gathered my coat, nodded once to Ava, and walked toward the door. Outside, the sky was pale and still. My breath caught in the cold air as I stepped onto the courthouse steps. I didn't feel victorious. I felt something better. Whole. Solid. Real. I hadn't won because I outsmarted them. I won because I stopped hoping they'd change and started protecting what they never valued. Me. The estate looked different now. The heavy velvet curtains were gone, replaced with sheer panels that let in light all day. The dark mahogany floors had been sanded and softened with warm oak. Brandon's planned office was now a sunlit library with soft chairs and a wall of books organized by color and chaos. The West Wing, once locked up for storage, had become a studio space where women met on Saturdays, women like me, who had spent their lives carrying families that never saw them clearly. I didn't erase everything. Some pieces stayed. The antique grandfather clock still chimed every hour, same as it had since I was a child. The stone fireplace remained, but the portrait of my great-grandfather had been taken down. I donated it to the town museum with a short note. Let legacy be something we choose, not inherit blindly. Brandon hadn't spoken to me since the court date. Last I heard, he was living out of a motel near the interstate, still pitching new ventures to anyone who'd listen. My parents had stopped calling too. There were no more long voicemails or guilt-laced emails. Just silence. At first, that silence felt like an echo, like the kind of emptiness that lingers after you shut a heavy door. But now, it feels like peace. No explanations. No more convincing anyone of who I am or what I deserve. Just stillness. And choice. Sometimes I walk the property at dusk, coffee in hand, the gravel path crunching under my boots. I look at the garden I planted, the lights I strung across the old oak trees, the fence I had repaired myself. None of it is perfect. But it's mine. And it's enough. I didn't keep the house because I needed to win. I kept it because I needed a place to belong. A space where I could breathe without waiting for someone to knock me off center. People ask if I hate them, if I'm angry, if I think about what they lost. And I don't lie. I think about it sometimes, but not in the way they expect. I don't miss the version of myself who stayed quiet. I don't miss cleaning up Brandon's messes or translating my parents' silence into duty. I miss the idea that we could have been different. That maybe, just maybe, they'd see me as more than the fixer. But I've let that go. This place doesn't feel like theirs anymore. It doesn't feel like mine. Either not just mine. It feels like something new. Something honest. They lost a house. I found myself. If you've made it this far, thank you. Really. I know this wasn't just a story about contracts and inheritance. It never was. This was about something quieter, heavier. The kind of weight you carry for so long that you forget it's not supposed to be yours in the first place. I used to believe that being the responsible one was a badge of honor. That if I just kept showing up, kept fixing everything, eventually someone would see it. Someone would say, "Thank you. We couldn't have done it without you." But they never did. And after a while, I stopped expecting it. I told myself the work mattered more than the credit. That being needed was enough. But being needed isn't the same as being valued. There's something nobody tells you about being the fixer. When you're good at holding everything together, people forget you bleed too. They forget you get tired. That you have limits. They forget because it's easier to keep asking than it is to notice when you're breaking. So no, I didn't destroy my family. I stopped enabling them. I stopped paying the emotional taxes they never noticed I owed. I stopped translating their disappointment into motivation, and their silence into love. I stopped explaining away the parts of myself that didn't fit the version of me they preferred. And the truth is, they didn't like that version of me very much. The version that set boundaries. That asked questions. That said, no, not this time. They called it betrayal. They called it selfish. But I call it survival. You can love people and still refuse to let them hurt you. You can carry someone for years and still decide to put them down when your back starts to break. You can say, this ends here. And it doesn't make you cruel. It makes you free. There are doors in this life that need to be closed gently. Others you have to slam shut. And sometimes, the kindest thing you can do for them, and for yourself, is to lock it behind you and walk away. People ask me if I'll ever forgive them. Maybe I will. In pieces. On quiet mornings. In the way I now speak to myself. Softer than they ever did. In the way I let my past exist without letting it define me. But forgiveness doesn't mean re-entry. It doesn't mean returning to the fire just because the smoke has cleared. It means I'm done carrying the pain forward. That's it. This house doesn't erase what happened, but it holds space for what's next. For stillness. For honesty. For the version of me that doesn't have to prove her worth every time she walks into a room. If any part of this feels familiar, you're not alone. If you've ever been the one who held the pieces while everyone else dropped them, I see you. If you've ever stayed silent to keep the peace, I see you. And if you're just now realizing that peace should never come at the cost of yourself, I want you to remember something. You're allowed to walk away. You're allowed to stop fixing things you didn't break. You're allowed to save yourself. I didn't destroy my family. I just gave karma the paperwork it needed.